Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover the Logos of Heraclitus by Eva Brann. This is book 10 for my 2026 reading list. Let me start this episode with a question. What would you say is the keyword of the entire Western philosophical tradition? Well, if you take a look at the title of this episode and in the book that I'm covering, you can probably guess what that term would be, or what Eva Brann says that term is. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But last week I was looking at the life and philosophy of Heraclitus on the podcast. And so I called that part one of a two-part episode about Heraclitus. And this week, what I wanted to do was dig in a little bit deeper into a term that Heraclitus used. And that term is logos. And I just have an interest in this term. It shows up in the first chapter of the Gospel of John in the New Testament, where John is saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, that translation of the word, that the Greek term used there is logos. So what did John mean when he used the term logos? I saw that Heraclitus used the term logos. And so part of this is I just want to see, is there a connection? You know, the things that Heraclitus is talking about with logos, is that the same thing that John is talking about when he uses that term? And so that's why I got this book. I got one other. I didn't have time to read it, but I read this book by Eva Brann. And so what I want to do in this episode is just share what I learned. And I think it's really interesting. And so I want to see if there is a connection between Heraclitus and John, but more so I want to just better understand the term logos and the concept of logos, because it shows up again in Plato. I remember seeing it in some of the early dialogues, and to where it would have the connotation of argument. So it's even fun to put some of these different meanings into the Gospel of John, in the sense of in the beginning was the argument, and the argument was with God, or different concepts or different ideas that are contained in this word logos. So that's why I picked up this book. What Eva Brann is doing is she's looking at all of the fragments that we have of Heraclitus, and she's trying to put together a cohesive philosophy. But with starting at the point of logos, also looking at fire, the kind of ruling principle that Heraclitus looks at, and then also with this idea of flux, of never stepping into the same river twice. So the logos, what Eva Brann starts at the beginning of this book, she says the logos is the order that is the cosmos. And I found that to be very interesting, because in the article I wrote this morning on Substack, I shared 4 of the main concepts that the pre-Socratic philosophers were dealing with. And these concepts are the cosmos, nature, ruling principle, and logos. So the first, the cosmos, this idea that there was an orderly arrangement of the entire universe. And also that these philosophers were not just looking at their particular city or town or even Greece or Italy. They were looking at the entire universe. They were trying to make sense of everything. So that's the first concept. The second is nature. And when they're talking about nature, they're talking about things that grow. And that is contrasted with techne, or artificial things, or things that we create. Third is this idea of a ruling principle, or something that can be tied to everything. And so for Heraclitus, that was fire. For other philosophers, it was water or air. And then this fourth concept is the concept of logos. So the fact that Eva Brann starts this book and says the logos is the order that is the cosmos, I thought that was neat, just in tying together 2 of those concepts. Later on, towards the beginning of the book, she talks about the logos in this sense. She says this: Logos is, I think, not only Heraclitus's keyword, but that of the Western philosophical tradition, which acts as a tradition because its moments are both bound together and driven apart by dialogue, the back and forth of the Logos. End quote. So there we have that question I started off this episode with, of what would you say is the keyword of the entire Western philosophical tradition? Eva Brann says that would be Logos, and it's not only Heraclitus's keyword, but also the keyword of the Western philosophical tradition. But I love the rest of that sentence where she said, Logos acts as a tradition because its moments are both bound together and driven apart by dialogue, the back and forth of the Logos. And the whole idea of the great books and the great conversation is that it is a great conversation. And so I love that that connection in that sense of what the Logos is this back and forth dialogue that is kind of both the keyword, the founding point, and the topic of the back and forth. So that starts things off, and then from there she goes into a few different ideas of what this term Logos means. And so here she says it goes back to a word that first meant to pick up and lay down or lay by, that is to collect, hence to count up or to tell, as does a bank teller, or to recount as a tale, and thus to give an account. And so I'll stop the quote there. So that those are some different things that Logos means. Then she goes on and says, thence comes a multitude of meanings connected to speech, especially as it is a vehicle for human rationality, both as the thought itself and the utterance that tells it. Later on, she says the Latin ratio, whence comes our reason, translates Logos. And so this idea of relation between things, or a ratio of things. And then she goes further with this: the Logos brings terms into relations to each other, particularly the ratio relation that connects two terms in mutually determining juxtaposition, especially in respect to their common measurability. Logos names a relation of magnitudes. And I'll stop reading there. There's also, she talks about the idea of Homer preserving this meaning of the Logos verb of gathering. So this idea of gathering. Now, in the last part of this section, she gets into, which was really my main interest in reading this book. And so here's this short paragraph. To return to Logos, it comes to mean the word that is from and with God, thus the Son. Heraclitus will play a role in this future use, since he will give Logos a novel, elevated sense that works its way down the centuries. His is a remote precursor to the Christian use. End quote. So here Eva is quoting that first chapter of John, and she's saying that Heraclitus will play a role in its future use, since he gave this Logos a novel, elevated sense that works its way down the centuries and is a precursor to Christian use. Awesome. That's why I read this book. That's what I wanted to find out. And there she addresses that head on. So that was really neat. Final thing that she says later on about the Logos, she says that Logos is both nature and its language. Now, Heraclitus, right away in one of his fragments, he distinguishes himself from the Logos itself. And the fragment is this: listening not to me, but to the Logos. It is wise to acknowledge that all things are one. And so right away, Heraclitus is not saying that he's the Logos. He's distinguishing himself from that. And let me read just a little bit more about that. Here is my meaning expansion of the fragment. And here she's kind of putting it in different words. I myself am saying this: It is my Logos. But in hearing me speak, listen not to the Heraclitus who is talking, but to the speaker, and speaker is capitalized, who's saying, and saying is capitalized, I am uttering, having heard and heeded him, as should you. Then you too will say along with me and him, for I am telling of a power that addresses us, that there is something wise, which it is wise for us to say along with the Logos and in agreement with it, because it is found embodied in our world. The unity is there is a unity relating everything in all things, end quote. And so this is this idea of the Logos. It's a unity relating everything in all things. Later on, I thought this was so cool, especially once you get into the dialogues of Plato and how Plato is trying to come up with definitions of things. So let me read this part. It first gives a similarity recognizing account that brings together different elements and only then extracts their qualitative relation, as Heraclitus does when he speaks of himself as dividing each thing according to nature and declaring its relation to others. I am taking advantage here of the fact that Heraclitus introduces the activity of dividing, the forerunner of the Platonic method of division, and its dialectical complement collection, end quote. And in this section, she's mentioning different dialogues by Plato, but here she's tying this idea of dividing things to come up with their definition. She's pointing that directly back to Heraclitus in how Heraclitus is doing that in his statements, at least in the fragments that we have. So I thought that was very cool. Later on, she ties Logos to Heraclitean fire. I spoke more about Heraclitean fire last week, but with this kind of all-encompassing view of putting together a cohesive philosophy, it's really neat to see how she ties those two things together in this book. She says, for the Logos, though heard, is not audible to the ears, but to the soul. I thought that was a neat way of talking about the Logos. It's not audible to the ears, but to the soul. So you get this sense that Logos is elevated. It's not just about speech or things that you hear, but it's a language for the soul. Let me read a section about Logos and flux. So that was one question that came up last week is what was Heraclitus's philosophy in the sense of, did he think everything was relative? Because you could read those sections about flux and never stepping in the same river twice and think, oh, Heraclitus thought that everything was relative and you couldn't really nail anything down. But listen to what she says here. In conclusion, the picture of Heraclitus as the philosopher of ultimate instability, of radical mutability, is just ludicrous. Isn't the Logos at once the design of a world order, the stuff in which it is realized, and its speaker within the human soul? And isn't this governing Logos steadfast in itself and the firm regulator of flux? End quote. The idea here is that yes, Heraclitus talks about flux, but flux is not the main thing. The main thing is this underlying Logos. And so there can be flux within this structure of Logos, but it's not the other way around. It's not flux that runs everything and then Logos is a part of flux. So I found that to be a helpful clarification. And it was something that was hinted at last week and in the works that I read in preparation for last week. I just thought that this was a little more helpful in clarification. Next up, Eva goes through and just talks about different people who were influenced by Heraclitus. And so she obviously talks about Plato and Aristotle, but she then has a section for John the Evangelist. And again, this is the reason I bought this book. I was very excited to get to this section, and she just sort of dismissed it. But let me read what she did say. So John the Evangelist is given here the merest but unavoidable mention. And so, a little dismissive there. But she says his gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word, which is Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And here she says, a Logos says that his speech and God at once would seem to be directly Heraclitean, but that is leaping to conclusions. John may have heard of God as Logos from the Stoics, or had in mind the biblical wisdom of God, as in Proverbs 8:22. Indeed, Heraclitus and an earlier prophet do seem to sound the same tune. And then she quotes Isaiah, but then she just kind of dismisses everything with this final sentence. But this is praise singing, not a research project. And then she goes on to other people. So I was a little disappointed by this. The reason I bought the book is to kind of see this connection between Heraclitus and the John the Evangelist. But she kind of skipped over that, but there's a lot of other material in the book that was helpful in that sense. One thing I found fascinating in this section where she's talking about people, the chapter is titled "The Afterlife of the Logos," and one person she mentions that may have been influenced by Heraclitus is Madison, and James Madison, and she says, "I know of no evidence that Heraclitus ever entered his reading or thinking." Yet she says this about the ideas of Madison. Thus, for Madison, faction and freedom, tension and vitality are facts of humanity. Though the first purpose of government is to protect the different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, its second is to keep citizens from overstepping their proper measures. Later on, she says, this Madisonian conception of 1781, which I do not think I've misrepresented by casting it in Heraclitean terms, is the political complement to the invisible hand of Adam Smith's economics. Under its guidance, people intent on competing, striving for their own gain, bring about a wealth-producing system of tensed balances and transformative crisis. And then she says, in English that we have on our money, out of many one, she says is a very Heraclitean idea. So I thought it was just neat to see her tying Heraclitus to James Madison. Last thing I want to mention is that she says this towards the end of the book. The world is logos enveloped and logos imbued. End quote. Very helpful book. I found it to be very interesting and in just in terms of what I was going for in just trying to discover more about the term of logos in for the purpose of helping me understand what was John saying when he was talking about in the beginning was the logos. I know I'm going to come across this term a lot more in the future reading that I have, especially with Plato and Aristotle. So I look forward to continually adding to this knowledge of what logos means. But this short book was a great place to get my feet wet in that. If I was to narrow this down to one thing for this episode, it would be just in understanding Heraclitus's flux and the idea of not stepping in the same river twice. That is kind of a subset of his overall system of logos, and not the other way around. That's really the one thing that has stuck out the most from this book. Well, I'm going to continue with my reading on the early Greek philosophers, and I'll be sharing what I learn. I hope to cover Parmenides in an upcoming episode, and then I think I'm also going to be writing about some of these early Greek philosophers as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed learning about this Logos of Heraclitus, and I look forward to this continued search into the early Greek philosophers. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@Books of Titans. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and please check out my website for a ton of resources and all sorts of fun things about reading. I will be back next week with another podcast episode, probably about another Greek philosopher. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.